Have a seat anywhere you like. Some of you have met me before. My name's Tim McKee. I'm from Manchester, Connecticut. I'm with the I'm on the National Committee of the Green Party. I like to say that I'm one of the founders of the Green Party. If you can bring and blame me, I started the Green Party of Rhode Island in 1992. And, you know, we've been growing all across the country. We've had our ups and downs all across the country, of course, with about 205, almost 230 people across the country elected as green officials in different capacities. One state rep up in Maine. We had a lot of independents and, you know, an independent governor, that sort of thing up in Maine. So it's a great area. And they have a tremendous registration up there. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself and introduce your speakers?
Sure. Yeah. Okay, I'm David Bedell, Secretary for the Fairfield County chapter of the Connecticut Green Party. And I'm invited Mr. Thornton to come speak with us. I had been aware of his work for some years now, that he was had an organization called Efficacy, based out of Hartford, which addresses various issues, especially the problems of the war on drugs and drug policy at all levels. And he came to my attention especially this year when he announced an intention to run for governor of Connecticut on the Green Party ballot. So he said, oh, well, we better find out more about this guy. And so he's here to tell us something about his work on drug policy issues, and then I'll also ask him some questions about his campaign that he's intending to run. Clifford Thornton?
Yes.
I
don't really need that.
Let me just pose the first question. Can you tell us how you got involved in this issue? Something about your early life and how the issue of drug policy has affected you?
Yeah. Well, first off, I want to thank the Green Party for inviting me here to talk to you about what is probably the most serious problem we'll ever face in our life. And having said that, this is a long storied process for me about drugs. It started some 40 years ago when my mother died from an apparent heroin overdose two weeks before I was to graduate high school. And during that particular time, I thought all drugs should be eradicated from the face of the earth. But as I watched decade after decade my native Hartford, Connecticut go downhill, I began to challenge what was going on with the drug war. What I saw was that there were more draconian policies put in place, but it did not stop the flow of drugs into my native Hartford. And the straw that broke the camel's back was when I was working and one of my supervisors was arrested for supposedly selling drugs. And what I found out was that, unbeknownst to him, he was introduced to a drug dealer. This drug dealer gets busted, and in order for this drug dealer to get leniency, he has to finger X number of people. They gave him 10 years on the conspiracy theory, and that next day I went in and I retired early, and I've since dedicated my life to ending drug prohibition. My early life with drugs, I can remember things like when I used to deliver newspapers to a lot of the people in the neighborhood. A lot of them had arthritis and rheumatism. And I remember specifically one morning delivering paper to this woman who loved to talk, and she used to always have coffee and juice for me, and we used to sit down and talk. But one morning she said, well, I haven't had my medicine and I really can't talk. And, you know, not understanding what it was all about, she was using cannabis or marijuana for her arthritis and rheumatism. I mean, that smell was right there. Another early reference to drug use was when I was 8, 10 years old, I would imagine, and my uncle and 3 or 4 of these guys were standing under the street light, and they were passing what I thought at the time was a cigarette amongst them, and they were laughing hysterically. And I was wondering, you know, what the hell are they laughing about? So I went over to them, and I was listening to them say things like the cow jumped over the moon, and they would just laugh hysterically. And I'm saying, well, damn, that's not funny at all to me. But they thought it was very funny, and they just kept passing the cigarette. And see, I didn't understand what marijuana was all about at that time and what they were doing. So the other thing, too, that I remember coming up is that there was quite a bit of heroin use within the community, but it was a lot different then than it is today. And the only way you knew an individual was using heroin was that during the summertime they wore long sleeve shirts to cover up their tracks. And they would always keep the younger people away from them because they didn't want them to get involved. It was a very different scene. And all of the heroin addicts that I knew at that time were very well dressed. And they carried themselves in a way that you wouldn't know they were using drugs. They would rob you to death, of course, but that's the way in which that was my early understanding about drugs and how it affected me. Also, during that particular time, my great-grandmother and grandmother raised me, because my mother was not around because she was out in the street and getting into the drug scene and so forth and so on. But during that time, understand it was very private. The young people were shunned away from it. They didn't want them to get involved. And it was a code. It seemed like an unspoken code among drug addicts of that time not to let people know what you were doing or how you were doing it. And many people never knew. So, you know, that's a lot of my experience at a young age with drugs. Not knowing that they were drugs, but now that I look back, I can see what they were doing.
And do you think that's changed, the way that drug users comport themselves? Well,
I think we can ask the audience and see that it's changed tremendously. Very seldom you heard of a shooting involving a drug dealer and another drug dealer about turf, because that just didn't exist. There was usually, I didn't know it then, but there was usually one person that dealt in drugs, and that's where they went to get the drugs.
Let me ask you more about your life. I understand you had a career in business before you started this organization. Can you tell us what kind of work you did and how you decided to make the switch to your present organization that you're doing as a volunteer basis?
I worked at Southern New England Telephone for almost 25 years in middle management. I was in charge of all corporate telecommunications within the corporation, serving something like 10,000 people. My job was to install simple line and bell sets, or the people, I had 23 people and 2 supervisors working under me, to install simple line and bell sets to complicated telephone systems, PBX, Horizons, and all the telephone systems at that particular time, and also standalone computers to LANs and WANs and that type of stuff. Just think of it like this. When you call into the telephone company to get anything done, I was responsible for all of the infrastructure that you had to go through, from the simple telecommunications, when you call in and you want a simple line put in your set, that's highly involved. It would go through what we call the service rep, and from the service rep it went to service order, and from service order it went to an installer. That was just a simple thing. But if we were talking you wanted complicated things, we would have to reroute your call. We would, I was responsible for voice protocol within all the systems that you came through. I mean, you don't see the infrastructure behind it. All you see is the final result.
And then how did you and your wife started the organization Efficacy? Can you tell us how that came about and what exactly is Efficacy?
Well, when our children were just about out of the house, we decided we had to do something else. So I started doing a local jazz program at the University of Hartford, but it didn't involve my wife. So what we did was we decided we were going to have a public affairs show, and we named the show Efficacy. Efficacy was a program that the telephone company offered that really lit a fire under my butt. It pushed me to do other things, and that's why I named it Efficacy. But when my wife and I started doing public affairs, we were doing things from abortion to race relations to domestic violence, education, all types of topics that were of interest to the community. And we did something like maybe 20 to 25 shows. But everything we picked up somehow, some way led back to the drug problem. So what we decided to do was that we were going to put together an hour generic show about just drugs in America. Well, that garnered tremendous interest. So we decided that we were going to put together 3 one-hour shows. The first one dealt with the history of drugs in America. The second one dealt with the crime and violence associated with drugs in America. And the third one dealt with economics, the monies that we were spending to fight the war on drugs. Well, after that, it took on a life of its own. People were calling in, sending in letters. They wanted us to come and lecture and do workshops, and it went on. And we put out a newsletter at that particular time, and at the height of the newsletter, it was reaching over 6,000 people. Most of the people were in the United States, but it was worldwide. And from that, we realized we had to learn more about the drug problem. And we traveled all over the world looking at programs in Europe and in Canada that were working versus what didn't work. So that's how we basically got our start doing Efficacy. Efficacy is an organization that looks at peaceful ways at solving social problems.
Okay. And are you still dealing with problems other than the drug war, or is that your focus now?
What we found was that the drug war is related to everything we were doing. The drug war is 2 degrees from everything in society. This is why everything we picked up somehow, some way, led right back to the drug war. It's 2 degrees from society. Think of it this way. Drug policies in this country dictate most of our international policy and all of our domestic policy. Look at it that way. Whenever something is passed in the federal Congress, and most of the time in the state legislatures in this country, it is somehow, some way related to the drug problem.
Can you be more specific? Give us some examples of what you found to be the major flaws in our drug policy, and what you saw as a better solution to dealing with drugs.
Well, for instance, when we talk about race in this country, which is definitely it's a social construct, but most of the people that are put in prison are black and brown and really poor white people. But most of the people that use drugs in this country overwhelmingly are white. Judge Scheinblum, who sits on the Superior Court up there in Enfield, said, the drug war is meant to be waged, not won. He said all these drugs should be legalized, medicalized, and decriminalized. Otherwise, we're going to continue with this downward spiral that we're in right now. Most people don't understand what the drug war is all about. It is connected to our education system, in that, especially within the inner city, we see why education is so expensive. I mean, when I went to school, and probably when you went to school, a security guard was unheard of. Metal detectors were unheard of, and a lot of other things. And I spent 2 years substitute teaching in 3 school systems in Connecticut. One in Hartford, which was the urban poor, one in Windsor, Connecticut, which was a couple of steps above the inner city, and out in Avon and Farmington, where it was more affluent. The only thing that was constant between all 3 school systems was the flow of drugs in the schools. Am I answering your questions?
Yeah, that's the flaws. How would you recommend changes in the policy? You talk about decriminalization, medicalization, legalization. How would that play out?
Well, all of those terms mean something a little different. When I talk about legalization, think of legalization like with cigarettes or alcohol. It's controlled and regulated. When I speak of medicalization, which is a form of legalization, think of it as a prescription type drug where you would have to go to a medical doctor to get the prescription, and you would come under their supervision. When I talk of decriminalization, think about the laws staying on the books as they are, but instead of you going to jail for small quantities of drugs, you're given a slap on the wrist and a fine, and it's usually a misdemeanor as opposed to a felony. Now, under decriminalization, it would vary. It could vary from city to city, state to state, and so forth and so on, just as mandatory minimums do. There's no one set mandatory minimum for each state. There's 2 sets of mandatory minimum, one at the federal level and one at the state level. And of course, federal laws supersede state laws.
Well, let me ask you, even if they were, drugs were legalized at the state level and the federal level, wouldn't that mean that drugs would be easier to get?
Well, let me ask you this now. If you went out this door and it was, let's say 12 midnight, or well, we'll say 2 a.m. in the morning, and we went out this door, you would find it very, very difficult to find a place to get alcohol or cigarettes, correct? Am I correct? Huh?
Alcohol, certainly.
Yeah. But you would not find it difficult to get any type of drug that you wanted. It's the same applies to a 5-year-old or 6-year-old getting up out of the bed at 2 a.m. They would find it difficult to get alcohol or cigarettes, but they could get any of the drugs that they want as long as they got the do-re-mi. What we have in place right now is a very liberal policy which says that anyone who has the money can get these drugs. What I am offering is a highly conservative policy in that it would be much more difficult for people to get drugs, especially our children. If we're really going to be serious about this and we really want to protect our children, let's look at selling tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana out of one place. And that would be the only place these substances could be purchased. This would cut the access for our children tremendously. not serious about this, because if we were serious, this drug war would have been over long ago. Understand that I would like to see cannabis legalized, and along with, well, I say cannabis, but everybody else says marijuana. Okay, marijuana legalized, and along with it, hemp. I would like to see heroin, methamphetamine, ecstasy, and heroin, methamphetamine, ecstasy, and cocaine medicalized, coming under the doctor's supervision. I would like to see all of the rest of the illegal drugs decriminalized for future debate and true and honest medicinal study.
So you would recommend that drugs still be illegal to sell marijuana or any of these drugs to a minor?
Oh, of course. Now, I do believe that the age that you can go into the Army is 18, correct? Well, the age has to be 18. Anytime you're willing to give up your life in the armed services, then you should be able to use these drugs. I mean, to me, that's just plain old common sense. Okay, 18 would be the age. I don't want our children to have these access to these drugs, and it's an unlimited access for these children, because time and time again you see where hundreds of thousands of children are arrested every year for having basically